So getting a little bit into the weeds here with each of these different buckets. So with external scouting, some of the challenges that I've found are usually companies do this through external consultants or groups. Not always, but many times it's external. Sometimes there's an internal team of scouts. Either way, you're paying for people's time to go and scout. So that can get expensive. Secondly, it's time consuming. They have to go out and find those companies. It's not automated. It's just, literally going out and trying to find, and in a pre-COVID world, that was going to conferences, and that has expenses as well. It was expensive, time consuming, and then there was an increased latency between what the organization needs and what the scout is out getting. So there's, over time, that creates a mismatch. So the external scout, because they're not part of, let's say, all the internal conversations happening, they might not be aware of certain needs that change or certain nuance. So they bring a company, the corporate says, hey, that's actually not what we're looking for anymore. We need somebody with this capability. And then you're back to square one. And so it ends up taking longer and costing you more money than you thought. And then lastly, but I think very important, is that there's no guarantee that the startups that they surface are actually interested in working with your corporate. Or maybe they're precluded from working with your corporate. They might already have another agreement with a competing company and have some kind of exclusivity clause that they've signed. I think this is a bigger deal in certain industries than others. Cosmetics happens to be one of those industries. So I dealt with this a lot, where if one of the big companies works with a startup, particularly if they have a technology that goes physically into a product, so a chemistry or biology startup, they'll often insist on exclusivity, and they'll pay handsomely for that exclusivity, but it means that you can't work with, there was a skin microbiome company that we were really interested in working with, but they had signed an exclusivity deal with one of our larger competitors, and nothing we can do about that at that point. So that happens in certain industries. I think that is specific to what you're working on. So you just have to think if that's an issue for you. But even if that's not an issue for you, there's still a chance the startup may say, hey, we don't want to, get distracted by working with a corporate at this point. Or maybe this is like a side thing. Their main business is selling to consumers, let's say. So there's always that risk that you're going to spend time scouting, surface a company that you think is a really good fit, and then find out that they are not interested in working with you, or they're not able to work with you.
On your last point about startups maybe not wanting to engage, there are many people in the startup community that say, don't let a strategic invest in your startup if you want other customers, because there are too many problems with control and strategics killing follow-on investment. So I think what could be really good is to have a plan as a corporation. This is how we engage with startups that make it beneficial to both of us to do that, to kind of assuage some of those concerns, because there's a lot of fear among startups about getting a big corporate involved and losing control of the company.
I mean, I have thoughts on this, but Neil, I know you do too. So
yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I think that's increasingly becomes an issue. It's kind of like the issue of if one bad actor can kind of ruin this for a lot of companies. And so, yeah, I think you're totally right. It's important for the companies to be transparent about that. And then I think this kind of goes back to the external part of this, is if they have other VCs that they've worked with, or other sort of, I hate this term, but influencers in the startup ecosystem who kind of endorse what they're doing, and maybe they've looked at their docs and they've looked at examples of how they've worked with companies, and they say, yeah, these, somebody like Sean, to be honest, looking at a corporate's program or their investment requirements and saying, yeah, this is something that I, as a VC, if I had backed a company and they were approached with this from a strategic, that I would be okay. I'm on board with how they're doing business. So yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents there. But I think everything you're saying is spot on.
Yeah, and I think you want to distinguish between investing on the same terms as everybody else invests and the special terms that you're giving them. And it's not necessarily that you don't want to give some special terms to a corporate. I mean, this is sort of an extreme example just to make the point that not all special terms are bad. Like, they could commit to doing $1 million a year of revenue, and that would be a quote unquote special term that you would be probably pretty delighted to get from them. Now, that would be more one you should be arguing for than they should be arguing for. But I think the types of terms that you're talking about, James, are things like a right of first refusal, information rights. Are they in the boardroom? Are they a board member? Are they a board observer? Some of these more control provisions. And I think you do want to be really, really careful with those. I'm happy to talk to people about this. I would say, like, in the interest of this being recorded and broadcast, I don't want to give like legal advice on a Zoom call like that. And I guess for the recording's benefit, I'm sure I won't give any legal advice one-on-one too. But I do think, there are things to think about, and it's important to get kind of advisors weighing in on it, and certainly lawyers in the right situation as well. But just, I think that the higher bit is like, when they're asking for preferential terms, you want to think about the downstream implications of that. That's the thing to focus on here.
Yep. So open innovation is another way that companies engage externally. It comes with its own challenges. So number one with open innovation, and again, just as a refresher, when I refer to open innovation, I'm talking about where you're publicly making your needs known and you're inviting innovators to apply and bring those innovations to you. So something like, hopefully you're in front of a computer and not on mobile, but if you want to Google for a few of these examples, P&G has a website called Connect and Develop. That's a pretty good example. You can also search, I think it's Pepsi has an open innovation portal that's pretty good. And these are a couple examples. And we'll get into some tools and sites you can use later. But just if you want an example of what open innovation means, you can Google around a little bit. But number one challenge that I've found with open innovation is there's some selection bias going on. So the startups that are probably performing best and having the least trouble getting customers and are kind of running full speed are less likely to be the ones hunting around open innovation portals for opportunities. So there's a little bit of a selection bias going on there. The second thing, and something that I've actively worked on, is most startups do not know that your open innovation portal even exists. Even if they're relevant, even if they would love to do business with you, they don't know that it exists. So if you look at where companies are posting their opportunities, it's, on the LinkedIn page, if you're a big CPG company, you're posting it on your LinkedIn page that you have an open innovation opportunity. Well, a lot of the people following you on LinkedIn are probably following you for job information, or maybe they already work there. They're probably not startups, right? I mean, most likely they're not startups. There's probably some, but most likely they're not. If you post on your, let's say you're a CPG company and you post on your Facebook page, well, your Facebook page, again, is followed probably by your customers, not by potential startups who would apply to that. So you're kind of reliant on these like almost word of mouth getting to the right targets. And it's a little bit difficult to get in front of the right startups if they have no idea that your portal even exists. The next thing is kind of similar to a lot of job applications, quite frankly, is that you have no idea what happens once you hit submit on that open innovation challenge website. Sometimes they tell, they'll put a face on the challenge, or they'll put a face on the portal and say, oh, this is the team behind the open innovation group. But very often it's just a black box. You have no idea who's on the other side of that. You have no idea if they're even reading it. You don't know, when you're going to get a response, if you're going to get a response. Making that a little more personal, I think, is valuable. And there's some ways you can do that. And then last but not least, there's no pre-qualification of the responses for good reason. You don't want to limit your funnel, but that often means you have to sort through maybe irrelevant applications or applications that don't quite fit the scope of what you're looking for. You might get 100 responses, but 40 of those 100 are off topic or different than what you wanted. And so you have to sort through that, which adds time and kind of makes the process a little bit more difficult. Has anyone here participated in an open innovation challenge, either from the corporate side or from the startup or applicant side?
This is Ross. I can share a little bit. We did something similar, but just internally. So it wasn't open innovation of going out to other companies, but it was the same thing of, we have 25,000 employees. Why were you relying on 5 to come up with stuff? Let's open it up to the whole company. And even there, it's tons of irrelevant responses. It's out there, but these all really echo true. And at least doing that, a lot of the stuff we got was stuff that we had already had on the plate. So it didn't add a lot. We did not continue this approach. It didn't feel like I got much out of it.
It's a tough approach. I mean, it can work really well, but yeah, everything that you just said resonates. And it's interesting to hear that the same challenges happen internally. I've only seen this in an external facing side, but it sounds like all the same challenges exist if you do this internally as well.
I've played matchmaker on some of these challenges. What you said is right. Funnel is hard. You put out this challenge and, there are 10 startups that are a good fit, but none of them hear about your challenge. So every now and then I'll I'll see something and then know somebody and try and connect the dots.
Yeah.
So
but it's very ad hoc. It's like you're almost reliant on luck in some cases, right? Because Matt, if you don't see a challenge in time, you're never going to make that connection, and it's just a matter of you're not building a system. Let's put it that way. You're relying on, and sometimes you'll get lucky and it'll work out, but you're not doing something that's like a sustainable process necessarily.
So if you're a
Yeah.
startup looking for innovation challenges, subscribe to Neil's Open Innovation newsletter, which every couple weeks will send some into your email box. Just going to plug that. I love reading it, even though I don't have a startup.
But it sounds like you're forwarding them to people.
I am.
Yeah.
I will read something and and send it to somebody.
Matt, I think one of the things that you just touched on that I did want to like double click on a little bit is one of the values to doing external innovation, like one of the real benefits is getting outside of your industry. And so that's one place where these open innovation challenges can be really useful, is because you're finally publicly talking about needs that you have. And so even if it's, let's say, not as systematized or you can't predict what's going to come in, there are plenty of people doing like what Matt is doing, where he's seeing something, says, oh, that actually sounds like it could work for this person, so I'm going to forward it to them. By doing things openly, you do kind of create your own luck in some ways, that you actually open up that opportunity for others to forward this to people who might not even know that your company exists. So, or that at least these opportunities exist. So there is definitely benefit to doing it publicly. A challenge that's not listed on here that I have encountered though is internal resistance to sharing these things externally. I won't say the company, but there are some very private companies out there who do engage in innovation, but they'd rather pay a premium for a scout to go out and find companies rather than publicly share what they're interested in. And that might be different industries have different concerns around that. Different companies have different cultures around that. And so I don't know if there's like a right approach or wrong approach, but I will say that's a challenge that you will run into if your company doesn't do open innovation and you want to kind of convince them to. They'll say, oh, well, won't everybody know what our roadmap is now, from a technology standpoint? I think the answer to that is there's certain things that maybe you don't want to share publicly, but there are other things where, everybody knows that you're out there looking for this. I mean, a silly example, but an easy example is, there's not a CPG company on earth that's not looking at sustainable packaging right now. And that's so obvious that you're not losing anything by making that public, right? Everybody in your industry already knows that you're looking at it. Every investor out there knows that you're looking at it. So you don't lose anything by posting that need publicly. Maybe there's other areas or other industries where that does actually, really make a difference, where you don't want to share publicly. And I think that's fully valid as well. But maybe thinking through, if you're trying to make the case for this at your company, thinking through what are the things that, are already clear that we're interested in, and we can kind of create our own luck a little bit by talking about this publicly.
I'll say I don't know if this is a challenge to add to the list or just something that sort of tints all the challenges. But when you have an innovation challenge that requires going sort of outside of your industry or sector, when your challenge isn't related to the sort of, the kind of startup you need isn't really in the same area of the economy as the company you're running, that makes it harder to make a connection, to sort of speak the other party's language, just to get attention. And startups have the same problem in reverse too. If you're a green tech company and you're not selling into energy companies, you're selling into consumer packaged goods or agriculture or utilities or something like that, publicly owned utilities in particular, it creates this extra set of challenges that I don't think anybody is really good at navigating yet. Governments have this problem in spades. B2G is especially difficult for these challenges, but the sustainability and green technology that you mentioned, Neil, is also right up there on the list, with places where you have sort of communication and translation and attention problems, because people sort of don't know how to ask for what they need, and they don't know where to ask for what they need.
Yep, 100%. University research partnerships can be really interesting, but I found, and again, this is my perspective, curious if others have different opinions, but often at universities, the research is at a basic science level, not so ready for a product that's going to go out to customers, particularly at a large scale. Sometimes it doesn't even have a clear application. And that can be, that's important research still. But as you're thinking about your innovation pipeline, using that to actually, let's say if you need a product out in 2 years, a research partnership at a university is probably not the part of the funnel where that's going to come from. So the timelines are a little bit stretched out. A lot of times tech transfer offices are not fully aware of all the things that are happening on their campus. So it can be difficult to surface where the opportunities even are. There was a startup that was working on this. I don't actually know if they're still around. I don't actually think they are, but they were trying to help companies better access research and partnership opportunities with universities, and vice versa, help the universities and particularly the researchers at those universities find partners who are interested in sponsoring their research and commercializing their research. But it's really hard because, at the moment, it's in a lot of cases, it's ad hoc. And I know this was a few years ago, maybe there's better tools for this now, but I know at Estee Lauder, we had a handful of universities that we would speak to regularly, Carnegie Mellon being one of them. And it was just, regular calls with the tech transfer people to see if there was anything interesting. I mean, it was that's the level of sophistication, I would say, of the tools and process. So it's hard to surface something in that way. That said, it did work. We did surface interesting things. It was definitely a part of our innovation mix, but it seemed like there were ways to do things better. I don't know if there's better tools for that now. I'm actually curious for maybe if Ross, you guys have done something, or anyone else has worked in this space with universities. I'm curious if the tool set is different than what it was a few years ago.
We haven't done anything actively with universities.
All the best stuff I did at Carnegie Mellon falls under this headline. I finished my dissertation because of a university partnership, corporate startup lab, obviously, tons of university partnerships with corporations. There isn't a set toolkit. For some companies, it sort of depends on what you need. Not every tech transfer only works for things that the tech transfer offices pay attention to. And for that, you need to know, what does this university's tech transfer office pay attention to? And that's kind of idiosyncratic. And what they think of technology isn't necessarily what you think of as technology. So increasingly, we're seeing companies just investing in having a presence on campuses where, they think interesting stuff is happening, from, Johnson & Johnson putting a conference room into the Optum Startup Studio at CMU. I wrote my dissertation with the PwC Risk and Regulatory Services Innovation Center, which now has a new name. If anyone can crack that, I'm sure there's value there, because right now companies are spending a lot of money just to sort of be in these rooms and be in these conversations, because the upside is pretty tremendous for them. We probably next year, maybe we do an entire hour on how to run these things and what your options are.
They'll tell you one of the best predictors of increase in relationship between the university and Business Carnegie Mellon and companies is how close their office is to campus, which to me just kind of illustrates the point on how inefficient these things really are. If the most efficient way to do it is to go to Bakery Square and rent some space, there has to be a better way than that to accomplish this.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess to be fair too, structures like CSL are, ways to go and do this too. The reason to go work with universities is there are tons of really smart people and a lot of cutting edge things happening. And so it's I think Matt, you said it properly, the upside is definitely there. I think it's the how part that's really tricky on this one.
There's also this this sort of serendipity that can occur with proximity with these conversations. That sort of adds a bullet point to that first slide you had on the value here, where the first level is okay, company sponsors some research directly, company cares about a question, research team at the university cares about the same question, they combine resources to answer that question. But then there's another layer that happens where it's almost I want to say a barter system or a trade, where you might be interested in adjacent questions or things where, oh yeah, I'd be happy to add something that wasn't on my initial agenda if we have a good working relationship, or you're providing some kind of support, financial or otherwise. When I was working on my dissertation, I spent a few weeks helping PwC with some of their internal corporate innovation, corporate startup ideas. Because I could do in a week what would take them a month or two. And in exchange, they have this, data provider they pay a ton of money for that my poor grad student budget could never accommodate. And they say, oh yeah, you help us, get 2 months ahead in a week on this problem, and we'll do 2 months of data wrangling for you and just email you the results. And that was huge savings for both of us, and we were happy to make that arrangement. But it wouldn't have happened if we weren't talking to each other about what we were interested in and what we needed.
Yeah, so serendipity, I think, can be added to that earlier slide.
I was just going to add engineered serendipity, to borrow one of Sean's favorite terms, where you set yourself up to maximize your chances of getting lucky.
Yeah, and then supplier-led innovation, which I had mentioned some of these challenges earlier, but there's some interesting issues with this, right? So one, the suppliers, they want to sell to you, but you also implicitly know that you're not their only customer, and they're probably also selling to your competitors. So everything that you're seeing, your competitors are probably seeing too. Not probably, I would say definitely seeing. So it's a little bit difficult to get something completely different from the supplier-led innovation. That said, obviously you can combine things that they are working on that might combine with things you've developed internally or other sources of external innovation. For example, maybe there's a startup that you recently started some work with and you find a supplier bringing you a technology that actually is really complementary to what that startup is doing. Well, maybe there's a way you can combine those pieces. But all this just to say is like supplier-led innovation definitely has its pluses. I think it's pretty good for incremental improvements, but it's tough to get sort of the long-term kind of game changer type innovation coming through your traditional suppliers. Anyone have a different experience with that or related? I know, Ross, you said you guys do a decent amount of supplier-led
Yeah,
stuff, right?
I would say the things that I typically have seen for us is it's really that long-term alignment of incentives, right? And so there's things like on the second bullet point here, we're working with our competitors as well as us. We'll have things suppliers are and this is kind of a combination back to the original tech scouting as well. It's kind of somewhere in between the two. We'll have things we might want to work with somebody on, and if we could really lock it up to only us being able to do it for a while, it makes sense. But then it can be hard for us to align incentives where we're interested in helping them develop it, but then locking them out of competitors or something along those nature. Or if it's then investing in it long term, our comp structure in our company is a certain way, and it's very different than the kind of the incentives on the startup side. And so then again, when we've had those types of things, we looked at it and typically something doesn't end up happening because we just realized that we're not going to be able to give an alignment on how people are compensated on things and stuff like that. Those are what typically I struggle with on this is what will it do with my competitors and can I get incentives where everybody's, kind of pushing for the same thing?
Yep. So having like a period of exclusivity or something where maybe they're doing something custom for you that they wouldn't go do with anyone else. So I definitely want to talk about tools just because I think this might be an easy way to kind of add some value to people here. So if anyone has tools for external innovation that they want to share, that I'd love to hear those, and then we can move on to the slides and some of the tools that we've surfaced. Oh no, go ahead, Ross. I see you unmuted.
Insight stuff some.
Yep, CV Insights. Yep, it's a very good tool.
It's old fashioned, but just showing up at conferences, especially ones outside your field where innovation is happening that's relevant to your field.
That is very underrated, and you'd be surprised how much value that could drive. Well, Matt, maybe you wouldn't be surprised as you do it, but I think that's really, really valuable and very underrated.
You can usually, after the presentation, just talk to the expert.
Yeah, and they're happy to talk to you.
Like finance companies will send people to like the American Economic Association's big annual research meeting, but in most industries, it's not common, and you sort of rely on sort of getting lucky or a reporter finding the thing you're interested in and then writing an article about it that you then find when you can just go to the source and get 6 months ahead of your competition.
Yep.
Very old tech though. Showing up in person is very 2019.
Yeah, I guess 2019 is considered old school now.
now it's even easier. I attended a conference in Rome last fall from my living room. So
yeah, that's true. That's exactly right. Yeah. All right, now I can share some tools with you. So this is from the scouting front. Ross, you mentioned CB Insights. They're a great tool. There's a whole bunch of other tools as well. There's a database called Traction. There's Stardust. I think we've also seen Linknovate. Full disclosure, we obviously, as Sean shared early on, also run a innovation and startup scouting company called Xtivate. If you are interested in Xtivate, we're a tech-enabled service that kind of does the top of funnel of that external innovation scouting process for you. You tell us an area of interest. We get back to you within 3 weeks with market information as well as a list of startups that are relevant to you. And then that's where we stop. If you're interested, reach out to me. I'll give my email later in the process. But full disclosure, that's our company in this space. But those are some tools that you should check out if you haven't and you're interested in this. CB Insights is probably the best known one in the space, and a lot of companies are subscribed to them, but there's a few others too to check out. On the open innovation front, there's a bunch of different options here. So there are if you want to first focus on challenges, so the innovation challenge front, there's platforms like Halo, which is a company that basically so they have a portal where they'll host the challenge, but then they also have a community of researchers, startups, and other innovators that they give those challenges to. And then most importantly, and I think this is sort of the value of a platform like theirs, is they actually help you sort through the responses. So you don't have, you might get 600 responses. There's I think Bear is one of their customers listed on the website. And there was a case study that they did with Bear where I think they got 590 responses or something on one of the innovation challenges. And they actually helped them sort that down to maybe, I think, like 30 really relevant ones that they wanted to actually dive deeper into. So going from that 500 something to 30 is not not trivial if you have to do that yourself. So platforms like that are really interesting. There are groups like Venture Fuel, which will help you actually, if you're not sure how to set up the innovation challenge or even what you'd be looking for, they'll do that sort of early stage sort of strategy work with you to figure out what you'd want to get out there, and then how to craft that into a challenge and figure out how to market it. And that's more of like a traditional consulting approach, but obviously very niche to one area. Then you have the accelerators and incubator approach. So groups like Techstars or High Alpha can help you set up incubators and accelerators. We don't have time for my opinion on that, so we'll skip that for now. But there are groups that can help you set that up. I think structure and measure we've talked a decent amount about already, but we can talk about it here for a second. And I don't think we need to go into the next slides. We can just have like a discussion about it. One of the things that's hardest to do in the innovation space is measure success. And I'm curious how anybody in this group thinks about success in the innovation space. Like, Ross, for example, or Sean, I'm sure you have opinions on this. Like, how do you measure that in a quantitative way and then qualitatively as well to decide if what your efforts are successful or not?
I think some of this becomes kind of leading and lagging indicators, or sort of, how close it is to, how quickly you can get feedback, right? Because ultimately, these truly transformational innovations take a long time to actually materialize. And so what you want to try to figure out is, what are the things that you can see along the way that let you know that you're on your way to that. It's sort of like everybody knows in venture capital that unrealized write-ups are not that great a proxy for ultimate return, but they're significantly better than any of the other proxies that LPs have come up with. So they spend a lot of time looking at what the unrealized write-ups are, because it's the best we have to work with. And I think in a corporate innovation setting, you want to sort of figure out what the moral equivalent of those things are. So I think that's things like, early customer wins together, where some independent third party has validated that this is valuable outside of you and the external partner that you're working with. So a third party coming in and using that, some type of progression through milestones, things like that.
This is Rob. So I would say we haven't done a very good job of this yet. I think for us, we measure how many things we've looked at, and we measure how many things we've actually then turned into something commercial. But beyond those two things, we haven't done a good job of measuring other impact we may have had or something like that.
You are not alone. It is a really hard thing to do, because what you're trying to do is measure how good you are at increasing the frequency of a long-term low probability event. And any statistician will tell you that doing anything in any kind of problem of that flavor requires a lot of time and a lot of data, but you have to start making decisions well before any level of certainty can come your way. And there's also the confounding factor of, people respond to incentives and you value what you measure. So say you find that patents are a good intermediate stage. We really care about is how many billion-dollar business ideas am I going to come up with over the next couple decades, but you don't have a couple decades to measure it. So you look at something like patents, and, for some companies, that's a good measure. For some of them, it's not. But if all of a sudden you start rewarding people based on how many patents they file and get, then you're not steering them towards billion-dollar business ideas. You're steering them towards how many patents can you file. So you want to measure things and, incentivize people to get you the data you need to do this. But if you steer the incentives too hard in one direction, you can wind up changing the very thing you're trying to measure by changing the incentive structures facing the people doing it. sometimes the best you can do with a long-term thing is, find these good intermediary stages that correlate with the outcome you care about, or, from other people's experience and research and comps that, these are things you should see along the way. What's my funnel like? How many ideas do I kill? That's a good metric that people like to use. But if you incentivize killing ideas and you just reward people, like the more ideas you kill, the better. It's like, great, I'll come up with like really terrible ideas I can invalidate very quickly. And that's not the behavior you want at all. So it's tricky because you got to manage both the statistical difficulty as well as the sort of people management side of it. So Russ, you are very much not alone. I don't think we've talked to any company that has solved this problem, and we have talked to some statisticians that think it's basically an unsolvable problem, and you just sort of do the best you can, and everybody's best they can is going to look a little bit different depending on the idiosyncrasies of their people and problems.
Yep. I'll just wrap this up with a very quick anecdote related to what Matt was just saying, and I'll try to dig up the blog post and see if we can share this, but there was a European bank that made the mistake of measuring pilots done as their key metric. And they basically ended up with, like, over the course of 3 years, like 100 pilots or something. But then in terms of projects that actually moved beyond a pilot, it was like 1, because nobody was focused on that at all. So Matt, you're spot on. You kind of get what you measure. And so it's a really tough question. I don't think there's anyone's really figured it out. I think different companies, it's like you're constantly managing ways to measure, but then also make sure people aren't gaming the system, which they undoubtedly will. And subconsciously too. It's not even like a conscious thing necessarily. So we do have to wrap up now. I know a bunch of people have hard stops as well. I will say this was fascinating to hear everybody's perspective. I'll give my email here in the chat if anybody wants to connect more and discuss these things. I love having these types of conversations. So happy to connect with any of you. So I just put mine there. Dalal is also great with these types of conversations. So Dalal, maybe you can put your email there as well. And then the email list that Matt was talking about is openinnovationleads.com. I'll put the link there. There's a free newsletter. So when you go to the site, it'll look like it's a paid thing. There is a paid thing. There's no pressure to go join that, but if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, there's just a little email. You can submit your email. That's all you have to do. There's no other information. And that's sent every 2 weeks with different open innovation opportunities from a variety of industries. There's no particular industry focus on that.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Talk to you soon.